Welcome back to the Reader's Podcast, everyone, and to another deep dive. So we've got another fascinating set of sources you all sent over, and we've been going through all the great stuff in Adam Grant's Think Again.
Oh, yeah, this one is a really, really fascinating book, all about rethinking.
Yeah, like why is it so important, and how could it change your life, and how do we actually get better at it? So let's jump right into this. Grant starts off by talking about these 4 thinking modes that we all fall into. He calls them preacher, prosecutor, politician, and scientist. And you can probably guess what they're about just from the name.
Yeah, I think so. Preacher mode is like when you're super strongly defending your beliefs, like if you're arguing with your friend about the best pizza toppings.
Oh, totally. And then there's prosecutor mode where you're just trying to prove everyone else wrong. It's like that family debate about politics during the holidays, you know?
Yeah, totally. And politician mode, like you just want to win approval and fit in. Like when you agree with your boss's terrible movie recommendations. Just trying to stay on their good side.
Yeah, been there. But the real star of the show, the one that really unlocks rethinking, is that scientist mode.
Right.
Which is about approaching ideas with curiosity and being willing to be wrong.
Right. So it's kind of like you think of a scientist, they're not going to cling to a hypothesis if the data is telling them it's wrong.
Right.
They're going to be excited by the new information. So that's kind of the mindset that we want to cultivate.
Yeah. And this is where things get interesting. Grant argues that even the smartest people can get tripped up by these cognitive biases that make rethinking really hard. And he focuses on 2 in particular: confirmation bias and desirability bias.
Confirmation bias, that's our tendency to look for information that just confirms what we already believe, even if we have to ignore evidence that contradicts it.
Yeah, it's like that friend who just refuses to believe that their favorite band is not actually that talented. Like you take them to all these concerts and they're just off-key and everything, but they just refuse to believe it.
Yeah. And then there's desirability bias. That's when we see what we want to see, even if it's not really there. You remember that BlackBerry CEO who totally dismissed the iPhone?
Right, yeah.
Because he was so attached to the physical keyboard?
He was so attached to that keyboard that he missed the whole touchscreen thing.
Totally missed the boat on the touchscreen revolution.
Yeah.
That's desirability bias in action.
Yeah.
It blinds us to what's possible because we just, I don't know, we're clinging to what we already believe.
And what's interesting is Grant says that intelligence can actually make these biases worse.
Yeah.
So if you don't learn how to recognize and manage them, you could just end up using your smarts to like dig yourself deeper into your own wrong beliefs. So how do we avoid these mental traps? Grant says it's all about embracing the power of doubt.
Yeah, he calls it confident humility. It's like believing in your ability to learn, but acknowledging that you don't have all the answers. And he uses this really good comparison. He contrasts the BlackBerry example with Steve Jobs, right? So Jobs, he was initially resistant to the iPhone, but he was open to being persuaded by his team.
Right.
You know, so it's not about flip-flopping or being indecisive. It's about updating your beliefs based on new information. And that was like a key factor in Apple's success.
Yeah, it's like updating the software on your phone.
Yeah.
You wouldn't just keep using that old version.
Right.
Right. The same with our beliefs. We need to update them as we learn more.
And you know, one of the things I thought was so refreshing about this book was this concept of actually finding joy in being wrong.
Oh, yeah.
So he talks about this Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, Danny Kahneman.
Right.
And this guy actually gets excited when he finds out he was wrong about something.
Imagine that.
I know, it's wild, right? Most of us, we see it as a blow to our ego. But Grant suggests that if we detach our opinions from our sense of self, being wrong becomes the signal that we're learning and growing.
Yeah.
So instead of getting defensive, we can get curious about why we were wrong, what our blind spots were, what new information can we learn. So I'm curious, what's a time that you realized you were wrong about something? How'd that feel? Was it freeing? Or was it, I don't know, did it feel like a threat?
I think.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's almost like that aha moment when you finally figure out a puzzle. You know, you're stuck for a while, but then when you finally find the solution, it's like so satisfying.
And this idea of embracing being wrong, it can actually make our relationships stronger too. So Grant dives into this by talking about the difference between task conflict and relationship conflict.
Okay. So task conflict is when you're debating ideas. So it's like that brainstorming session where everyone's throwing out ideas, even if they sound crazy at first.
Yeah.
And it can actually lead to some really innovative solutions.
Right. He uses the example of the Wright brothers. They had these really heated arguments about the design of their airplane. And their willingness to challenge each other, to have those past conflicts, led to the first successful airplane.
Wow. So arguing can be a good thing. Who knew?
Right. But there's a big difference between, like, a productive debate and just fighting.
Yeah, of course.
Right. So relationship conflict, that's when things get personal and nasty.
Right.
And that's when rethinking kind of goes out the window because everyone's just protecting their ego.
Yeah, for sure. So how do we have those constructive arguments then? The kind that lead to those breakthroughs?
Well, Grant gives some really practical tips for turning arguments into adventures, as he calls it.
Yep.
One of the most important is to shift the focus from why you're right to how your ideas would work in practice.
Good.
So it's about testing your ideas, not just defending them.
So it's like saying, okay, let's assume I'm right. How would we actually implement this? What would the consequences be?
Exactly. And another really powerful technique is asking genuine questions.
Okay.
It shows you're really trying to understand the other person's perspective,
Yeah.
and it encourages them to explain their reasoning.
So instead of like interrupting or preparing your rebuttal, you're actually listening
Right.
and trying to like get to the heart of their argument.
Totally. And that can create a much more open and collaborative environment.
Yeah, for sure. Now, sometimes the best way to change someone's mind is to actually listen to them.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Grant introduces this really cool technique called motivational interviewing.
Okay, I've heard of this.
So instead of trying to convince someone to change, you ask these open-ended questions that guide them to explore their own reasons for wanting to change.
Okay.
So he gives this great example of a doctor using this technique to persuade some parents who were hesitant about vaccinating their kids.
Oh, wow.
And by asking questions about their concerns and their values, he was able to help the parents come to the decision to vaccinate on their own.
Wow. It's almost like planting a seed of doubt and then letting it grow organically.
Exactly. And it's much more effective than just lecturing someone or trying to force them to change their mind.
Okay. So we've been talking a lot about changing our own minds and persuading others, but what about those really deep-seated beliefs we have about groups of people, like stereotypes and prejudices?
Right. Well, Grant, he tackles this in a really interesting section about challenging stereotypes and prejudices.
Okay.
And he focuses on sports rivalries, like the Red Sox and the Yankees. Like, he even tried to get Red Sox fans to cheer for the Yankees.
Oh, good luck with that.
Yeah.
It's amazing how we can get so attached to these like arbitrary group affiliations,
Yeah.
even when we have no personal connection to the team or the players.
Yeah. It's like we're programmed to choose a side and then defend it no matter what, even if that division is totally random.
Right. So to help us break free from these really ingrained biases, Grant introduces this concept called counterfactual thinking,
Right.
which is basically imagining alternative realities
Mm.
to kind of challenge your assumptions.
Right. So it's like, what if you had grown up in a family of Yankees fans? Would you still feel the same way about those teams?
Yeah.
It's a crazy thought experiment, but it can really shake things up.
It forces you to think about how your beliefs are really shaped by your circumstances and experiences,
Yeah.
not necessarily by some like objective truth.
Right. And actually, this is kind of interesting. Grant challenges this really common advice that we always hear about, trying to see things from the other person's perspective.
Wait, isn't that a good thing? To try and understand where someone else is coming from?
Well, it turns out that simply trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes doesn't always make you more understanding or empathetic. Research actually suggests that sometimes it can actually backfire, and it can make you even more dug into your own beliefs.
Wow. Okay, so what's the alternative?
Well, instead of trying to adopt someone else's perspective, you focus on understanding it.
Okay.
So you ask those open-ended questions, you listen actively, and you look for common ground.
So it's about recognizing that there are multiple valid perspectives, even if you don't agree with them.
Exactly. And that kind of takes us back to confident humility.
Yeah, for sure. And, when it comes to opening someone else's mind, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just listen.
Right. And Grant, he talks about motivational interviewing again here. And he really emphasizes the importance of creating a safe space for people to just explore their own thoughts and feelings without being judged.
Yeah.
So it's not about imposing your own views. It's about guiding them towards their own conclusions.
It can be tough to resist that urge to just jump in with your own opinions.
Oh, I
But sometimes the most persuasive thing you can do is just shut up and listen.
Yeah. So, Grant, in this next section, he talks about how we can apply these principles of rethinking to planning our lives, especially our careers.
Okay.
And he challenges this really common notion of having a fixed 10-year plan.
Oh, yeah. Like, in today's world, who can really predict what they'll be doing a decade from now?
Right. It's like trying to use an old map to navigate a new city.
Exactly. Things change constantly, and we need to be able to adapt.
Right. So instead of clinging to these rigid plans, Grant suggests that we think of work as a series of actions rather than fixed identities. So it's about experimenting and exploring.
Okay, I like that.
So, he talks about encouraging kids to do science instead of pressuring them to be scientists. It's about fostering that love of learning and discovery, not putting them in a box.
Right.
And this leads to another really crucial point. We need to regularly rethink our goals and plans.
Right.
Because as we gain more experience and our values change, what we want out of life might change too.
Yeah.
And if we just cling to these outdated goals, it can lead to a lot of frustration. It can make you feel stuck.
So how do we make sure we're staying on track, even as our goals are evolving?
Well, Grant suggests that we treat our careers like scientific experiments.
Okay.
So we test hypotheses, we gather data, and we adjust our course based on what we learn.
Okay.
So it's all about embracing a growth mindset.
Yeah. This really resonates with me because I used to think I had to have my whole career mapped out. But now I realize the most exciting opportunities usually come from those unexpected detours.
Exactly. It's those detours that often lead to the most profound learning and growth. And that brings us to one of the most important messages of the book, I think.
Okay.
Rethinking is a skill.
Okay.
And it's a habit we can cultivate.
Right. So it's not something you're just born with or without. It's a practice, like meditation or playing an instrument. The more you do it, the better you get.
Exactly. And it all starts with those core qualities we talked about earlier: humility, curiosity, and that willingness to be wrong.
Right. Those are the ingredients that fuel that rethinking cycle.
Mm.
And when we embrace rethinking, it opens us up to making better decisions, building stronger relationships, and living more fulfilling lives.
Totally. It's about approaching life with an open mind,
Yeah,
ready to question and learn and evolve.
I love it. Okay, so before we wrap things up, I want to leave you with a little challenge.
Okay.
What's one area of your life where you were ready to think again?
Maybe it's a belief that you've held for a long time, or a career path you're questioning, or a relationship that's not working.
Yeah, whatever it is, we encourage you to use those principles of rethinking.
Mm-hmm.
So challenge those assumptions, ask those tough questions, and be open to the possibility that you might be wrong.
Yeah, you might be surprised by what you discover.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that's kind of a big deal for all of us these days. Communicating in those really charged, polarizing conversations, like politics, religion, even those intense online debates.
Oh, yeah.
So Grant, he really dives into how we can communicate better in these types of situations.
Right.
And he makes this really interesting case for embracing complexity.
Right. So he argues that we often fall into this trap of what's called binary bias.
Okay.
It's that tendency to oversimplify these complex issues
Right.
into just two opposing sides. Like, you're either with us or against us, and there's no middle ground.
It's that us versus them mentality.
Exactly. But the reality is that most issues have multiple perspectives and a lot of nuances that we just miss when we think in such black and white terms.
Yeah, totally. And he uses climate change as a perfect example.
Yeah.
So in the U.S., it's often framed as this strictly partisan issue.
Right.
But when you look beyond those labels, you see that there's actually a whole spectrum of different viewpoints
Right.
on the causes, the effects, the solutions.
Right. And acknowledging that complexity can actually lead to more productive conversations.
Yeah.
It allows for that space for people to engage with each other's ideas without feeling like they have to pick a side.
Right. So what are some ways we can have those more nuanced conversations?
Well, Grant suggests a few techniques. One of the most effective is to acknowledge the other side's viewpoint
Okay.
and then try to highlight areas of agreement.
Okay.
So instead of just stating your opinion, you might say something like, I see where you're coming from and I actually agree with you on this point, but I see things a little differently over here.
So it's more about building bridges than putting up walls.
Exactly. Another good tip is to point out caveats and contingencies. So, not every research finding applies universally, and acknowledging those limitations makes your arguments more credible
Yeah.
and less likely to make people defensive.
Right. So it shows that you're thinking critically and you're not just trying to cherry pick evidence to support your own point.
Exactly. Now, this is interesting, Grant. He actually challenges this common advice about taking the other side's perspective.
Oh, yeah. We talked about that earlier.
Yeah. Remember we were saying how it doesn't always lead to more understanding or empathy?
Yeah.
In fact, sometimes it can have the opposite effect.
Right. So what's the alternative?
Well, instead of trying to adopt their perspective, try to understand it.
Okay.
Ask those open-ended questions, really listen to what they have to say, and look for common ground.
So again, it's all about recognizing that there are multiple valid perspectives, even if you don't necessarily agree with them all.
Right. And sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is just listen.
Yeah. We keep coming back to this, but it's so important.
It really is. And Grant brings up motivational interviewing again here.
Okay.
And he emphasizes creating that safe space for people to just think through their own thoughts and feelings without judgment.
Yeah.
So instead of trying to, tell them what to think, you guide them toward their own conclusions.
Which I'll admit can be pretty difficult for those of us who enjoy a good debate.
Yeah, for sure. But sometimes, honestly, the best thing you can do is just be quiet and let the other person do most of the talking.
You know what? You're absolutely right. Now, in the last part of the book, Grant shifts his focus to how we can actually foster rethinking in groups and organizations. And he uses NASA as a case study, and he highlights the importance of something called psychological safety.
Yeah, psychological safety. It's that feeling that you can speak up, ask questions, admit you made a mistake,
Right.
and you won't be punished or humiliated for it.
Right. So it's creating this environment where people feel comfortable taking risks and challenging the status quo.
Exactly. And you know what? This is kind of scary. He points out that a lack of psychological safety was a major factor in both the Challenger and Columbia space shuttle disasters. So in both of those situations, engineers actually had concerns, but they didn't feel comfortable speaking up.
Wow, those tragedies really highlight how important it is to create a culture where people feel empowered to speak up, even if it means challenging authority.
Exactly. And Grant, he gives us some really good strategies for building that psychological safety.
Okay.
And he really emphasizes the power of leaders modeling vulnerability and humility.
Oh.
So, for example, at the Gates Foundation, he spearheaded this Mean Reviews video series.
Yeah.
And in this series, leaders, including Melinda Gates herself, they read aloud critical feedback from employees.
Oh, wow. Talk about leading by example.
Right. And it made such a difference. It created this ripple effect where it became more acceptable for everybody to acknowledge their areas for improvement and give and receive constructive criticism.
So it normalized the idea that we all make mistakes and that learning from them is way more important than hiding them.
Exactly. And beyond psychological safety, Grant also challenges these really traditional performance cultures that just focus on the results.
Right.
And he argues that we should evaluate decisions not just on the outcome, but on the process, too.
Yeah. So it's not enough to just succeed. We need to understand why we succeeded or why we failed. And we need to learn from those mistakes, not just punish people for making them.
Right, because if we only reward success, people are just going to cover up their failures instead of learning from them.
Right. So we're missing out on those valuable learning opportunities. And finally, Graham brings it back to the individual level.
Yeah.
And he encourages us to rethink our approach to work and to life in general. He challenges the idea that we have these fixed career identities and that we need these long-term plans. And he advocates for this more fluid, adaptable approach.
Right. So it's about looking at work as a series of experiments, exploring those different paths, staying open to new possibilities, and most importantly, remembering that it's never too late to rethink our direction and change course.
So there you have it, folks, our deep dive into Adam Grant's Think Again. I hope you've enjoyed exploring rethinking with us, for the personal level, all the way up to organizations and everything in between.
As you navigate the complexities of life and work, remember to be curious, to question everything, and to be open to the fact that you could be wrong.
And who knows, you might just discover how awesome it is to be wrong. It could lead to some of your greatest breakthroughs.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, happy rethinking.
So that wraps up our deep dive into Think Again.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot.
We did, from individual thinking modes to rethinking in organizations.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how much ground this book covers. What really struck me was how practical it is. It gives you actual tools to use these concepts in your everyday life. It's not just a bunch of theory. It's like a call to action.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you all go out and rethink the world around you, remember those core principles.
Right. Humility, curiosity, willingness to be wrong.
Be open to new possibilities. And don't be afraid to ask those tough questions. Challenge your own assumptions. You never know what you might discover.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We hope you found some great insights and you're feeling ready to think again about the world.
And if you want to keep the conversation going, share your thoughts with us.
Yeah, let us know on social media or through the channel's platform. We'd love to hear your stories about rethinking. Until next time.